Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 19th of January 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, is Mike Robinson. We're delighted today to be joined by Vanessa Beeley. And we've also got David Scott reporting from north of the border with Northern Exposure.
Vanessa, we're going to get straight into Syria, and we mentioned this on the programme a couple of days ago, but I wanted to get your comments on it. This is Minister for the Middle East, Alistair Burt, who said the UK continues to play a leading role in response to the tragedy in Syria. We have committed nearly £2.5 billion to a humanitarian response to the crisis. I'm alarmed that in spite of commitments to de-escalation, the regime and its backers continue to bomb and shell opposition areas in eastern Ghouta and Idlib. In recent weeks, these regime offensive have killed hundreds of civilians, displaced tens of thousands and destroyed hospitals and other civilian infrastructure. The attacks must stop. As I say, I wanted to get your thoughts on Mr. Burt's comments and just a bit of comment from you about what's actually going on in these areas.
Well, as we know, there is a huge chasm between reality on the ground in Syria, where I am right now in Damascus, and the narrative that's being promulgated by particularly the UK Foreign Office and its aligned corporate media or colonial media outlets. In fact, I spent the last 3 or 4 days in a town called Salamiyah in Hama, which is receiving many refugees and has received many refugees from Idlib since Nusra Front and various other associated extremist factions invaded Idlib city and the area, the region, back in 2014, 2015. Now, the narrative from those refugees who are basically waiting to return home, having been driven out of their homes, by the 74 UN member state coalition of terror and their proxies on the ground inside Syria. The narrative from them is that they wish that the Syrian Arab Army would liberate this area as fast as possible, even if it means the destruction of their homes, in order to cleanse this final pocket of Nusra Front-dominated terrorism inside Syria. If we then move to East Ghouta, I mean, this is a sort of another rehash of the spin that surrounded East Aleppo, Madaya, Zabadani, even Deir ez-Zor, is the fact that this is a pocket, East Ghouta, Douma, Joba, Harasta, which was retaken by Nusra Front about 10 days ago. In fact, I'd just driven through it the day before it was retaken by Nusra Front. All of these areas are occupied by various terrorist factions, whether it's Jaish al-Islam or Jund al-Aqsa or Nusra Front. It doesn't really matter. The majority of Syrian people don't make any differentiation between the branding of these extremist factions. But East Ghouta itself is occupied by terrorist factions. Those terrorist factions, as they did in East Aleppo and in Madaya, are receiving humanitarian aid that is being regularly delivered to this area, not by the UK, but by UN-affiliated organizations like Syrian Arab Red Crescent, but also, as I was told, by military command in the Russian mission here, by Russian humanitarian aid organizations that are taking convoys in there on a regular basis. So in reality, these terrorist factions are receiving regular humanitarian aid supplies. They are the ones starving and deliberately withholding medical treatment and food and other supplies and equipment from the civilians in these areas. And of course, the Syrian Arab Army has these areas surrounded, because this is the only way to contain these terrorist factions. And what is not being mentioned by Alistair Burt, of course, I was here last week, when for 4 days, the terrorist factions inside East Ghouta pounded this actual area, Bab Touma, the Christian and Shiite Muslim area of the old city of Damascus, with mortars in 1 day. And I couldn't actually leave the hotel on this day because it was simply too dangerous. Over 30 or 40 mortars fell in this area. 5 people were killed and dozens were injured. The footage from this day is terrifying. And even the days after that, if you go out of here between, say, 1 in the afternoon and 4 or 5 in the afternoon, you risk your life. It's as simple as that. The mortars can come in at any time, and they can land absolutely anywhere in the main shopping areas, in the civilian areas, in the residential areas. So when we talk about de-escalation and we talk about ceasefire, why is this not mentioned? And how are these terrorists receiving a resupply of their ammunition and of their explosive supplies in order to make these mortars, in order to launch these mortars into civilian areas? This is not being explained. So where is this 2.5 billion that the UK is claiming is going into humanitarian aid in Syria? Where is it going? Is it going, as we've already determined, to finance these terrorist groups, to resupply these terrorist groups, to re-equip these terrorist groups? And why are we not further investigating, or rather why are the organizations that should be investigating these crimes against the Syrian people not investigating them?
Yeah, good question. Now, you wanted to highlight this article from Press TV because this is pretty horrendous. 10,000 bodies buried in mass graves across Syria's Raqqa. Now, of course, was that the Syrian regime?
Of course it isn't. I mean, I was speaking to the Grand Mufti Hassoun only 2 days ago, and he described the discovery of these graves. And actually, if we go back to 2014, the Al-Huta pit, which is a huge pit in this area, in the Raqqa area, was actually discovered even back then to contain the bodies of Syrian Arab Army soldiers that had been massacred and just flung or burned and flung into this pit. So, you know, these mass murders, over 10,000 bodies found. I've been told that over half are Syrian Arab Army soldiers, at least a quarter are women, and the rest are civilians from the Raqqa area. So these civilians were murdered by the ISIS terrorist group that, of course, has been proven time and time again that the US coalition is colluding with this group, despite saying that it's waging a war against terror on this group. And so, you know, the mass murder of Syrian Arab Army soldiers, who we, in the past few days, again, have been conducting interviews with families of martyrs from the Syrian Arab Army. And what I will bring is their testimony that the Syrian Arab Army is the Syrian people. Every single family in Syria has a member or a relative of their family in the Syrian Arab Army. So fundamentally, this is a massacre of the Syrian people that is not being discussed in mainstream media. It's not being highlighted that basically the US coalition-supported terrorist group has massacred Syrian people in Raqqa and created this mass grave.
Okay, and then finally on this subject, Vanessa, I wanted to just get your thoughts on this because Sputnik have been speaking to the Russian ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov, and he has said that the Russians are quite keen to send an invitation to the United States and other UN Security Council members to participate in the Syria National Dialogue Congress to be held in Sochi at the end of January. He said, "We consider the Congress as a forum designed to give serious impulses to the negotiation process under the auspices of the United Nations in Geneva and to the achievement of the accords by the Syrians themselves by mutual agreement and without preconditions. We call on international regional players that have an influence on the development of the situation in Syria to take an unambiguous position to the support of the Congress." So, you know, what are your thoughts on this? And do you have any insight into what the Syrians think of this this move to bring the US and others into the Sochi process?
Well, I mean, if we look back historically, since Russia intervened in September 2015, we've seen efforts by the Russians to maintain a role as an honest broker in international affairs in Syria. So it's not very surprising to me that they've extended this invitation to the United States. Do I believe that the United States will accept this invitation in good faith? No, I don't, because they never have done. And while Tillerson is putting out statements that the US will maintain a presence in Syria in US national interest, which is an extraordinary statement to make when they're fundamentally, you know, a presence is a euphemism for an illegal occupation of a sovereign nation in the northeast of Syria, which is in the interests of US oil and gas interests, and of course protecting its military outpost in the region, Israeli interests. And so while we have the US basically training, I think it's 30,000 troops along the borders of Syria and Iraq, and we know, and we've been told even by Russian military spokespeople and by Lavrov himself, that among those 30,000 strong troops trained by the United States are ex-ISIS fighters, ex-terrorist fighters, we can assume that the US is not anytime soon going to be relinquishing its illegal military presence inside Syria. And so, the Russians have proven themselves to be very intelligent negotiators and, if you like, chess players in this regional crisis. And so we have to, I think, have faith that Russia is trying to maneuver the United States into a position where it is responsible for its illegal presence inside Syria, and that it has to actually react to the calls by the Syrian government to remove this illegal occupation and to basically leave Syria. And until the US does get out of Syria, this war cannot be truly called over.
Yeah. Now, look, Vanessa, just I know you've got to run, but just one brief comment, if you would. Quite a few people in the chat box at the moment discussing the coverage of the Syrian situation by Lise Doucette from the BBC. Just wondering if you'd just give us a couple of moments of what you think of the BBC's coverage of the situation at the moment, as opposed to the way you're actually witnessing things.
Yeah, I mean, I did actually bump into Lise Doucette in the media office in Damascus, and we had quite a fascinating talk, which I won't go into in depth right now. But what struck me during our conversation is the reliance the BBC has upon, obviously, let's say, the NATO-aligned organizations that are producing the narrative on Syria. In other words, the UN Security Council. And of course, we have to consider that the narrative from East Ghouta, where is it coming from? Guess what? It's coming from the UK Foreign Office financed white helmets. It's not coming from anywhere else. I've struggled to actually get access to the East Ghouta region because, as I said, it is a military zone. The terrorists are being contained in various pockets to the east of Damascus, and therefore it's very dangerous and it's very hard to get into that area. But what struck me is that the BBC is not making any real effort to speak to grassroots civil society, Syrian organizations that are dealing with these issues on the ground here. They've equally not spoken, as far as I'm aware, to the Idlib refugees that you can find very easily both in Hama province, but also here in Damascus and Jeremiah, where many of them have fled and have been rehomed once they've fled the terrorist-held areas of East Ghouta and Douma, etc. So it's very easy to go onto the streets and to gather the testimony from the actual people that are suffering under this situation. But the BBC time and time again fails to do this. We've seen them in East Aleppo finally admitting that there are Eastern Aleppo civilians that are returning home since it was liberated from the terrorist occupation. But do we have any emphasis on the 800,000 people that have returned to East Aleppo since it was liberated from the terrorist occupation that the BBC was promoting and supporting? No. Do we have a retraction or an apology from the BBC to the people of East Aleppo that they basically ensured their imprisonment for those almost 5 years under terrorist occupation, that the BBC were calling freedom fighters, rebels, opposition, militants, etc. No, there is no retraction and there is no apology from the BBC. And until that happens, I can't consider the BBC reporting inside Syria to be either credible or respectful towards the Syrian people.
Okay, Vanessa, look, thank you very, very much for that. Look forward to speaking to you when you get home, and we'll speak again on this programme very soon, I hope. Thanks very much. Right, let's bring David Scott into the programme now. Welcome to the programme, David.
Good to be here.
Okay, we're going to start off with Jordan Peterson. Well, he has been making an appearance in a number of mainstream outlets over the last few days. This is the Evening Standard. Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson and the anti-snowflake crusader speaks out, and they have a discussion with him. But we have a little bit of video, and I hope that this Channel 4 takes this in the spirit it's intended and doesn't attempt to put a copyright strike honest. This is being used in the sense of fair dealing, because we're going to comment on it. But here's a little bit of video of Jordan Peterson being interviewed by Channel 4 News.
Let me move on to another debate that's been very controversial for you. And this is, you got in trouble for refusing to call trans men and women by their preferred personal pronouns.
No, that's not actually true. I got in trouble because I said I would not follow the compelled speech dictates of the federal and provincial government. I actually never got in trouble for not calling anyone anything.
Right.
That didn't happen.
You wouldn't follow the change of law, which was designed
not
to
once
outlaw
it was law.
discrimination.
No.
Why
Well, that's what they said it was designed to do.
Okay, you cited freedom of speech in that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I have exercised my freedom of speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on.
So
and that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
Gotcha.
You have got me. You have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head. Yeah. It took a while.
It did. Yeah.
It took a while. You have voluntarily come into the studio and agreed to be questioned.
Mm-hmm.
A trans person in your class has come to your class and said they want to be called
That's never happened. And I would call them she.
So you would. So you've kind of changed your tune on that.
No, I said that right from the beginning. What I said at the beginning was that I was not going to cede the linguistic territory to radical leftists, regardless of whether or not it was put in law.
David, that was just under 2 minutes of a 30-minute interview, and I do recommend that people go and listen to that if possible. But what struck me throughout the whole thing was that Cathy Newman, I don't think she got anything of what he was saying right the way through the interview. He kept having to correct her. She expressed the way that she understood what he was saying and framed her questions based on that. He kept having to correct her time after time after time. I don't think there was one single question she asked where he was able to answer based on her having an understanding of his position.
Yes, the full interview is really almost essential viewing. It's 30 minutes of joy, because here you have everything that is corrupt in Western journalism coming up against someone who's thought about his position, who has an important point to make, and like all important points, it requires precision, and someone who's used to using precise language. And you would think a journalist would be able to operate in that environment, but she wasn't. She was completely out of her depth. To quote Terry Pratchett, she got cheesed, which is like getting creamed, but it goes on for longer. And all through this, she was trying to mischaracterize Jordan Peterson's position, trying to paint him as an extremist, some sort of hater, trying to pin a label on him, and completely failing. And each time he resisted this by demonstrating with facts and analysis and reason why she was wrong. It was a masterclass on how to handle attacks from authoritarian left-wing ideologues.
If I can just add a bit in here, I think the thing we need to really focus on is this is an attack on language that people are using. So we have what I'll call newspeak itself. We have new words coming into the language through a political source, and then we are controlling the way people think and behave by the way their language can be controlled. So although we're saying this is a very amusing interview clip, if you actually dig into what is really going on here, this is a government agenda that lady is trying to reinforce. She's not challenging the policy that's coming through the government. She's attacking the man who has dared to stand up against it. So this is highly biased, we'll call it journalism. But the real danger is the fact that the policy has come from a government which is determined to change language so that they can change the way people think.
It's come from a government, but it didn't originate with the government. It originated somewhere else. It originated underneath the state, deep state actors, the philosophical vanguard of the new left, all of these sorts of things. People who were put in during the Cold War to undermine the state, and now the Cold War's gone, but the undermining continues. And the reason Peterson has found himself at the heart of this is very interesting. A psychology professor, not someone I'd come across before this controversy started, and a man who'd spent his entire life trying to understand how totalitarian governments and movements can exist. How is it that the Hitler regime managed to mobilize a civilized nation to do what they did? How is it that the Russian regime managed to take a country that had produced great literature and beauty of many sorts and foist on them the Gulag archipelago and 45 million or more dead of their own people? How does it happen? Now, he spent his entire life studying this. So when he saw it happening again in Canada, he said no. He drew the line. And that's why people are responding to him, because of his courage in drawing that line.
Thank you, David.
Okay. Now, yesterday we were talking about the Franco British Summit, the UK-France Summit, and well, more information has come out now on that. So the Defence Secretary joined the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the Foreign Secretary, other members of the Cabinet at Sandhurst, as we mentioned yesterday. Well, they've decided that Britain and France are the only two European powers with the ability and political will to deploy and sustain significant military force. And so they have announced a number of initiatives to strengthen UK-France cooperation, building, they say, on the 2010 Lancaster House treaties. They say that the UK will work with France and other European partners to support the development of the proposed European Intervention Initiative. The EII will be a defence cooperation framework that aims to improve operational planning and coordination of military deployments among European partners with meaningful capabilities. The EII will be separate from the EU, they say, and will be complementary to existing NATO, EU and JEF military structures and initiatives. They also announced an agreement between the UK and France on the importance of the ability of the UK's defence industry to continue to be able to engage in European defence research and capability development programmes. And this was the kicker, Brian, this was the kicker. The creation of a UK-France Defence Ministerial Council, creating a permanent and regular forum in which UK and French defence cooperation can be discussed by the two defence ministers. So what is that? Is that a unified Ministry of Defence?
It's a unified Ministry of Defence, Mike, but it's something much deeper than that. If you follow the policy through, we're told that as a result of the referendum, we're going to come out of the European Union. France is a major partner in that European Union. So we move slightly to the side, and then what happens is we're entangled in a morass of joint Franco-British partnerships, cooperation agreements, which actually mean we are not leaving the European Union, but something worse is now going on. We're dismantling our constitutional and political structure, and we are replacing it with a new political model. The moment we're talking about defence committees, my head says we're into Soviet-style political control. So this was always the agenda of the European Union. Now it's now they can't get at us direct as a supposedly a partner of the European Union. That agenda continues, but it's being brought in through the French. This is despicable, duplicitous politics by Theresa May and the Conservatives. And what they are now doing is dismantling Britain, because if we lose control of our military, we do not exist as a nation state. And Mr. Lee Rotherham of Veterans for Britain pointed this out in a document. He was absolutely correct. And I better just add, but we are surprised to see Mr. Lee Rotherham clearly still in bed with the very Conservatives pushing this policy. This is treason, Mike. I'm going to use the word. That's what I believe it is. It is treason because the public are being kept in the dark as our constitution and political systems being dismantled.
Okay, well, let's look at what Theresa May had to say herself. She said, "The President and I agree on the importance of the UK-France relationship, not just our security, but to European security. We're the only European countries who are permanent members of the UN Security Council, as well as members of the G7, G20 and NATO. And we are Europe's two foremost military powers. It is incumbent upon us to demonstrate leadership in meeting the great challenges of our time and upholding the international rules-based system." So this is what global Britain is all about. In the meantime, Matt Hancock was meeting his French counterpart, Francois Nissen, at the summit, and they were discussing how Britain and France are going to collaborate on AI and tech issues. And the UK Space Agency was meeting with their French counterpart, and they issued a joint statement to step up cooperation in space as well. So clearly we're heading for the merger of our countries. Perhaps that's an exaggeration, but
unless people stand up to be counted, and this is the key thing, we are exposing the detail of what's going on here. We have to rely on our viewers and listeners then taking their local MPs to task. Get those letters into your MP, get those emails running. Challenge the individual journalists in the newspapers and the BBC. People should be raging with offence about what's happening here because it is so obvious that Britain is now to be dismantled, I believe to be left as a sort of junk heap on the side of Europe, while the City of London power is going to carry on with the EU project as if Brexit hadn't happened, as if a referendum hadn't happened.
Yes. Now, the baby-faced assassin, that is Gavin Williamson, our current Defence Secretary, was experiencing the world-class technology of the new F-35 yesterday at a Lockheed Martin F-35 simulator, because of course we don't have any aircraft in the country, any real aircraft to show up. So this was an event held at the Institute for Engineering and Technology, and he was joined by MPs and journalists. So apparently the F-35 program is going to support 20,000 jobs over a 30-year production period, £9 billion for UK industry. And this cockpit demonstrator gave Gavin Williamson a feel for flying the new state-of-the-art stealth aircraft, apparently. We currently have 14 F-35s. They're currently based in the US, where they're practicing taking off and landing on aircraft carriers in the desert, as you would. That's the place you would do that. And 150 UK personnel based there, and they will fly to the UK later this year. They'll arrive at RAF Marham. Initial flight trials will then take place from HMS Queen Elizabeth in the autumn off the coast of the United States. So Gavin Williamson said, today demonstrates that we're investing in our brave armed forces by making sure they have the very best equipment, securing tens of thousands of British manufacturing and engineering jobs, and ensuring Britain will always play a leading role in making the world a safer place. Brian, it's perhaps unfortunate that the F-35 simulator wasn't apparently able to simulate the hypoxia that F-35 pilots have been experiencing.
That they really experience.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll just say that looking through the digital windscreen of that aircraft, the sea was remarkably blue, which means it was very warm. That would mean it would be too warm for the escorts that carrier needs to operate properly. So at the moment we have a huge white elephant, a vast ship, we have no aircraft, we have no properly trained personnel, and all of that situation has come across because the government has deliberately cut asset. Eye on the clock, Mike, so we'll leave it there. We'll come back to defence next week.
Yes. Now, Evening Standard, not very many others that I noticed reporting this, but the hashtag release the memo began trending on Twitter last night after some comment from Republican members of the House of Representatives in the United States over a memo, a 4-page memo that they had seen Apparently, some people were invited into a private meeting and were shown this. Congressman Steve King said it's worse than Watergate. Others saying that it was alarming, shocking. Mark Meadows, Representative Mark Meadows, said, I viewed the classified report from the House Intel relating to the FBI, FISA abuses, and infamous Russian dossier, the so-called Russian collusion. What I saw was absolutely shocking. Scott Perry said, you think about it, is this happening in America, or is this the KGB? That's how alarming it is. So basically what's gone on is that this dossier seems to provide evidence of Obama administration collusion with the FBI to break the foreign intelligence rules, foreign intelligence legislation, to gather information on Hillary Clinton's opponents during the election, and to fabricate this dossier from Christopher Steele and Fusion GPS. So, David, I don't know if you've seen this story, but if it is what they say it is, it's a nail in the coffin for the Clinton part of this whole discussion.
Another nail in the coffin, and I've spotted a little bit about this, including people standing up on the floor of Congress in America and saying that they were shocked and demanding that this information be released to the American people. Now, this has been a year and a quarter of utter failure by the Clintons and the supporters to destabilize the Trump administration using lies. This whole Russiagate, Trump Putin possible collusion talking points that's been gone over and over in CNN and all the other networks repeatedly, has failed. There's nothing there. Nothing has come to light in over a year. There's nothing to find. But what is coming more and more to the fore is signs that there's evidence leading back to the Clintons, back to the Clinton Foundation, back to Hillary Clinton, back to literally in some cases bodies in the woods,
yeah,
and back to deals with Russia between the Clintons and Russia.
Well, look, yeah, sorry, David. David, we're just keeping an eye on the clock here. But the reason I wanted to show the Evening Standard article in particular on this was because if you look down to the bottom, there's a bit of text which says, according to U.S. media, reports suggest the memo may contain answers to allegations surrounding the FBI, the U.S. Justice Department, and the Trump dossier. The dossier, which was published in full by BuzzFeed in January last year, contains a number of unverified claims about US President Donald Trump's ties to Russia. And I was very interested in the way that sentence was constructed. It's a very clever piece of journalism, and it comes back to what Brian was talking about with the use of language, because what they're saying is that it contains a number of unverified claims, and then it goes on to say about US President Donald Trump's ties to Russia. So they imply in that statement that the fact of US President Donald Trump's ties to Russia that fact is established, but that there might be unverified claims about that fact. But they are describing a fact as far as they're concerned. Of course, it's not a fact. It's allegations, and the allegations are utterly unfounded. And I was just very fascinated about the construction of that sentence, Brian, because it says something about the way that the mainstream media is playing this.
Well, mainstream media might utterly controlled, and they are using very, very sophisticated taught techniques in order to manipulate every word, every sentence, every grammatical structure they're using is designed to be doing something to our minds. And people need to understand this, and they need to understand the danger of the government's behavioural insights team, which boasted back about 5 years ago that it could now change the way people thought by what they were presented to read or what they heard over media. This is very dangerous stuff.
David, what's going on, staying in the United States, what's going on with Adam Kokesh?
Adam Kokesh is a long-time libertarian campaigner, campaigning against big government. He's an ex-Marine. He served in various hotspots in the Middle East, and was sufficiently troubled by what he saw and what he subsequently learned that he decided to reject the whole idea of a warmongering foreign policy and embrace a philosophy of peace and love and freedom. So he's been campaigning on this, and he announced his candidacy for the Libertarian Party's 2020 presidential candidate for the United States. And 1 hour later, he was arrested by the police on what appears to be trumped up charges. He's now sitting in a jail in Texas with an $80,000 bail hanging over his head. It seems somewhat of a coincidence.
And is there any indication yet as to what the charges are?
Drugs charges and some sort of tampering with evidence. The Kokesh team are adamant that no narcotics or anything else was found on their vehicle, and it's a complete miscarriage of justice. So we are seeing. I understand that the jail and the police department in question is inundated with freedom-minded people phoning in and complaining about their conduct. So we'll watch this one carefully.
Okay, now we'll move on to Scottish issues, but just before we do, you wanted to highlight the latest developments with the Fresh Start Foundation. Just very quickly remind everybody what this is.
So Fresh inquiry into child sexual abuse. We're about to undertake a 2-year series of roadshows around Scotland to reach out to people who have been subject to abuse or who have information. This will include policemen who have had investigations closed down, and journalists as well. So we're gathering all this information. Now, the 2 people here who founded the Fresh Start Foundation have retired from the board, although they're still very much on side with the organisation and helping us in many practical ways. But we're announcing here 3 new board members as the organisation gears up for the challenges ahead. So we're very excited to welcome Janine Rennie, to welcome Katrina Sylvester and Stuart Dinning to Fresh Start Foundation, and we're looking forward to the challenges ahead.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, we're, as we say, short of time here, but we had intended to cover this story last week. This is Kenneth Roy. Just give us some background on this.
Yes, this is a point. He's looking at the way the Scottish society and government are working and the lack of any clarity, the lack of any openness in government deliberations. And he focuses here on the comments that came out regarding the Cameron House fire, which is what you see illustrated here. Cameron House Hotel, a very grand hotel on the shores of Loch Lomond. There's a serious fire, 2 fatalities. And he comments that, well, the government response, he quotes the government's response. Of course, there will be a thorough investigation into what happened at Cameron House, and it's important that the investigation is allowed to run its course. But I can give an assurance today that the Scottish Government, with our partners and indeed the owners of Cameron House Hotel, will make sure that any lessons that emerge from this investigation are learned and fully applied. And he makes 3 points. One, that there's a cliche here, lessons learned. We're always told about lessons being learned, they're never learned. Secondly, we're always told about partners. There's no one group or person is ever responsible for anything in Scotland. It's all partners. It's all shared responsibility, which means in effect no one's responsible. So the bungling goes on, nothing changes. And the third thing he's talking about is allowed to run its course. Investigations in Scotland, like Clotha Bar, like Shackle Bale, run and run and run and run, and they never reach any timely destination. It's just, look, it's a version of the long grass.
Then we come on to this because this is a response from the Scottish Government that you wanted to highlight. And we've got a quote here from this, which says, we do not hold the information, because you've asked a freedom of information question. They're refusing to give the answer. They say we don't hold the information because there's no requirement for minutes to be taken at Scottish Government meetings. But David, that doesn't seem to follow based on the Scottish Government guidelines. We've got a quote here from them which say, a record should be kept of official meetings that deal with substantive government business. Private offices should arrange for a record to be taken of meetings with outside interest groups, including lobbyists, that will set out the reasons for the meeting, the names of those attending, and the interests represented. David, that sounds very much like a requirement to take minutes to me.
Absolutely. The first document here is dated the 18th of January, so it's very new. Signed Diane White, and it says that there's no requirement for minutes to be taken in Scottish Government meetings. This is entirely in line with normal practice across the UK civil service, so apparently there's no requirement to take minutes in England and Wales either. And then, of course, the second quote, that was from a document beautifully headed Transparency in Scottish Government, issued by the Scottish Government for an outside agency. This is them telling the world how they operate, and it's, of course, the entire opposite, the reverse of what they're telling their own people are their operational procedures.
David, I think I can assist with this one, having had a little bit of experience of requesting minutes and being fobbed off by the government or local authorities over many years. And I think your confusion is, this is tongue-in-cheek, of course, I think your confusion is that you are not understanding the difference between minutes and notes. What you actually find is that government departments will keep notes of meetings, and when you then discover that those notes are not accurate, it doesn't matter because they're only notes, they're not minutes, which most people would expect to be scrupulously accurate, particularly when it comes to important matters, actions and who's responsible. So the subtlety is the government now uses notes, and this is how the Cabinet Office attempted to lie over the insider dealing that Common Purpose was undertaking for contracts, and it took 2 goes to actually get them to amend their notes, i.e. produce proper minutes of notes they'd fabricated in the first place. So this is dangerous Soviet-style manipulation of meetings, very, very dangerous, because we are now suppressing the truth. But I hope you now understand minutes are bad, notes are good.
Well, it is Soviet, isn't it? Because the thing about the Soviet Union was the future was always certain, but the past kept changing. And so it would seem with the Scottish Government.
Yeah.
Okay, now we're with an eye on the time. We did promise some organisations that we were going to cover a little bit on the NHS today. We will do that, but it will require more work by the UK column in the coming weeks. But firstly, a big thank you to the person who highlighted this gentleman, Mr. George's web page, his Facebook page, which contains some interesting information which was to do with the NHS. And what they said was that there was a NHS programme going to be rolled out across the countryside. In Devon, there are now plans to introduce accountable care organisations to run all health services from the 1st of April 2018. Goes on to say that Stephen Hawking, Alison Pollock and colleagues have launched a legal challenge to stop Jeremy Hunt and NHS England from proceeding with plans to turn local NHS bodies into accountable care organisations. Now, I think some of this was highlighted to us a few months ago, but we do miss things, or sometimes at the time we're too busy. We've really picked up on it this time, so I'm going to encourage people to go to this website. This was further comment because people are saying that an organisation called 999 Call for the NHS are really trying to do something about this, so you can search for them online, and we're saying thank goodness we've got good people standing up. Here's Mr. Hawking. This is very interesting because he's shown there as speaking out in The Guardian. And what is all this about? It is some ways very complicated, in other ways simple. Here's the document from NHS England, new care models, integrating care, contracting for accountable models. I did notice this at the bottom. It says www.england.nhs.uk, new business models. Now, if you're confused, of course, this is not privatisation, but it's simply business, Mike. So don't get confused.
Don't get confused between privatisation and business. Right.
You can find this document online, so you can have a look at the sort of things they're talking about. New models of care, establishing the care model, supporting documents, key changes, planned changes, further development. This is nothing about emptying bedpans and caring for sick people. This is about constant management turmoil. And if I can do this as simply as possible, this is what they're playing around with. We've got these organisations, STP, Sustainability and Transformation Partnerships. They're across England. They are cost-efficient collaboration amongst local leaders and clinicians. We've got ACSs, Accountable Care Systems. They're like an evolved STP covering a subset of STP geography in which commissioners and providers in partnerships with local authority take explicit collective responsibility for resources and population health. Are you with it so far?
Absolutely.
That's good. And here are the accountable care organisations, the ACOs. ACOs and ACSs have the same objective of integration and having a single systematic approach. But it says the difference is that an ACO have a contract with a single organisation for the great majority of health and care services for population health. And we better bring in the MCPs and PACs. This is multi-speciality community providers and primary and acute care system providers. So you can see how this is really helping patients on the ward. And we just take a quick look at the King's Fund, which is well, Mike, we have to say it's independent. It's an independent charity working to improve health and care in England. And they help to shape this very policy that's coming in. This is partly where their funding comes from. It's always interesting. NHS putting in a lot of money itself, but also big business, drug companies, people looking to make a profit off healthcare. And if you don't know what accountable care is, here's a definition, which is that it's different. Is that different organisations from health and care systems work together to improve the health of their local population by integrating services and tackling the causes of ill health. So nobody understood that before, but now we've got this amazing document. Where does all this come from? The language of accountable care comes from the US, where accountable care organisations were set up under President Obama's healthcare. Well,
so this is Obamacare?
This is Obamacare, and if we bring in some of the good work of this excellent man, Michael Georges, and his Facebook page, here was a little summary of what it's really about. ACOs will be given the money for your care as an insurance premium and will pay out only for certain treatments. ACOs will in many cases be handed over to actual insurance companies and other private firms, and so it goes on. If you freeze the page, you can obviously read all of that. This is privatisation on reheat, as we would have said in the military. It's being pushed immensely fast. David, this is in your face that this, I'm going to use the word again, duplicitous Conservative administration is now rushing to privatise the NHS.
Yes, but what we have to remember is privatisation doesn't mean free market. It means a fascist system of regulated, nominally private firms. If this is the American system, it's maybe worth just briefly quoting what the Mises Institute says about the American healthcare system. Quoting here, it says, "No, this is not the free market system or anything remotely close to one. In a genuine free market system, prices reflect the decisions of consumers. Producers who solve significant problems are rewarded with high prices and profits. High prices and profits in turn attract lots of competition. The competition not only prevents monopoly, it also improves quality and, very importantly, increases supply, which is the only sustainable way to reduce prices. Consumers then get better medicine at lower prices. Producers dislike competition and therefore try to buy government help in manipulating or fixing prices. This is more easily accomplished in medicine because it can all be done under the guise of government protecting consumers, when actually the consumers are being fleeced and impoverished." So that's the system in America, and that appears to be coming here.
Thank you for that. As I say, we will do more and deeper analysis on the NHS in the coming weeks, because we know there is such immense interest in what's actually happening. Let's just end on this note. I was out walking in Plymouth last night. It was bitterly cold. I came across these two gentlemen from, the car said Bob's Window and Gutter Cleaning Service. And these two guys were out in the cold feeding the homeless who were there on Plymouth streets. This is the same Plymouth that says, I think there's only 17 homeless people in the whole city. And of course, across UK, we have more and more people homeless, unable to feed themselves, cold on the streets, but plenty of money to prop up banks that are going bust, or these other big global organisations. And of course, plenty of government money for bombs in Syria. I took this close-up picture of these excellent gentlemen, and the man who was there on the street said to me, "I hope you're not going to print anything bad about me." I said, "Certainly not, I'm here to support you," but because of where I was going, I didn't have time for any more. But ending on a good note, here's good people doing good things, and we need more good people to get out there in the cold. Maybe, well, they will be feeding the poor and homeless, or maybe they'll be working in other ways to really support people in this country. And the reason I couldn't stop to talk is because I'm delighted to say I met up with Bill Maloney, child abuse campaigner, last night, and very brave Met policeman John Wedger. And I'm pleased to say that we have a video interview with John Wedger that will be shown first of all through our members forum, but it will come into general public domain. But what two wonderful men. I would need a few minutes to talk about what was discussed, but I'm going to end by saying they stood up to be counted. They've made a huge difference. All of us are capable of standing up to be counted, and we need to do that. David, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to the people who've recently donated to the UK column. We still need your support. We always need that support. And if you're not yet a subscriber, please consider taking out a subscription. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.